Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 15th and final episode of the Svarim Chatter series on Sabbatai Zevi. On this episode of the series, I was joined once again for the third time in the series by Professor Matt Goldish, and we discussed a number of things, mainly tying up some loose ends, including Sabbateanism's effect on modernity and other various related topics. I would like to once again thank the corporate sponsor of the entire series, Gluck Plumbing, for all your service needs, big or small, in New Jersey, with a full service division from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, camera-ing main lines, to a simple faucet leak. Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. I want to thank all the listeners for the feedback for the series and for everyone's comments and emails and for listening more than anything. They can now be accessed on the new website, farmchatter.com. There is a tab there. You can the Sabbatai Zevi series, and it is in order from 1 till we'll be to episode 15, so you can check them out. I hope there'll be more Sabbatean related episodes in the future as well, just not part of the series. And also, if you enjoyed the series or have any comments, I'm always happy to receive feedback. Please email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com. And if you have any other ideas for a new series, the series went over very well. People really enjoyed it. So if anyone has any other ideas for possible series or guests for a series or topics, please email me. And as always, if anybody would like to sponsor a show or to just support the show, please email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Svarim Chatter podcast and another episode in the Sabbatai Zevi series. Actually, we'll term this one the finale episode, although there will be some more episodes related to Sabbatai Zevi and Sabbateanism, but we'll call this the finale as we tie up some loose ends. And on this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again for the third time this series by Professor Matt Goldish, who is the Samuel and Esther Melton Chair of History at The Ohio State University. And we will be covering, again, some final aspects of Sabbateanism. So thank you, Professor Goldish, for joining me once again.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's start off with a question. I think we probably touched on it somewhat in the first two episodes we did together, but we discussed, obviously, people can listen back to the original episodes of Sabbatai Zevi until his conversion, and then afterwards until his death, and then a little bit we discussed some of the figures after his death. But essentially, I guess, moving into the 18th century and whatever time period it is, what was really going on? Everybody knows of, obviously, there's the famous Irak of Emden and Eibeshitz, but there was many other. Ramesh Chagiz was going after others. There was a lot of heresy hunting, and there was clearly this perceived, or was this danger, this grave danger from this heresy of Sabbateanism and Sabbatean theology. So what exactly, and I've got this question from listeners, what exactly was going on over here?
So what's perceived as the danger comes from two different directions, which are closely related to each other. One has to do with the Kabbalah of Nathan of Gaza and Abraham Miguel Cardozo and Avram Yachini, and the other theologians of the movement. And eventually, in the 1710s, the developments in that theology of Nehemiah Chayon and of Baruchia Russo. The theology of the movement had been problematic from the very beginning, and especially this idea of Sabbatai Zevi, of mitzvah haba ba'avera, or the idea that certain transgressions of halacha, of Jewish law, were appropriate and had to be committed. That idea is taken up by certain figures later on, and they run with it in a big way. So Gershom Sholem had sort of pointed out, and certainly others following him, that Kabbalah had always had a certain potential for heresy within it. And people today, I mean, let's face it, in our world, rationalism has lost out and Kabbalah has won. We like Kabbalah and rationalism, Maimonidean rationalism, we still love the Rambam, but that kind of thinking, people associate that with heresy and problems, and rationalism is very. But Kabbalah, what could be wrong with Kabbalah? We love Kabbalah. Kabbalah, it's right. The whole thing is a gesher tzar me'od, because there is potential heresy and potential problems on both sides. And Kabbalah, there had always been this potential, but it was never realized, certainly in as spectacular a way as it was in the Sabbatean movement after Sabbatai's apostasy, after the death of Nathan of Gaza and Avram Yachini. In other words, really starting in the 1690s, the later 1680s, 1690s, Sholem says 1700, but I think it's already before that. You start to see people who take the Kabbalistic ideas that are associated, especially with the idea of the mitzvah haba ba'avera, the need for ritual antinomianism and antinomian acts, and the explanations for the apostasy of Sabbatai Tzvi, which is a sort of accelerated version of explaining those antinomian acts. They take that and they push it to an extreme, so that some people start rejecting various aspects of halacha. Baruch Russo ends up teaching that the fulfillment of halacha is its abrogation, that the whole thing turns the whole thing on its head. Nehemiah Chayon teaches a concept of three-part God. If that sounds familiar, it's because the guys down the street have that, and you may be familiar with that, right? Trinitarian doctrine. So now, a lot of scholars, especially today, who study Sabbateanism, focus entirely on that, on the extreme versions of Sabbatean theology and activities and actions. I think that was a relatively small part of the overall world of believers during that time, but they're very exciting and colorful, so we get excited about them. But so that theology is one piece, and obviously very closely related to it and based on that is the antinomian actions of Sabbatai Tzvi, of certain later Sabbateans, where it starts out as something like eating exactly a kizayis of bread on Pesach, which nobody's doing for their enjoyment. It's doing it in imitation of Sabbatai Tzvi, who taught that certain specific transgressions fulfilled certain needs in the Messianic age, and in other cases, right, it started to become more generalized. So you start having people doing some much more serious averot and transgressions of Torah law more systematically. So it really for a long time is just and continues in many places. Either people remain extremely observant, or they only do these small ritual transgressions that do not connect to a generalized antinomianism. But you start to get people who teach a much more generalized antinomianism. And I'll give you an example from my favorite character, Shlomo Ayalon, the rabbi of London and then Amsterdam for decades, at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th centuries. It seems he in the 1680s apparently converted to Islam with the Donmeh, with this group that in imitation of Sabbatai Tzvi converted to Islam and continued to be Sabbateans under in the guise of Muslims. So he apparently joined that group, and it seems that there were more than a few people who did what he did. He joined, and he was with them for a while. I don't know, a matter of years probably. and then he left and rejoined the Jewish community. But there were rumors, and apparently they were well founded, that while he was a member of this group, the leaders of the Donme encouraged him, or even I don't know, pushed him to trade wives with somebody else. So the wife that he came out with was not the same wife that he went in with. And as Rabbi Moshe Hajiz points out in Sheva Poshim, he was still with that woman. He was the rabbi of major Jewish communities, and he was still married to somebody whom, right, his divorce had not been proper, and his marriage to this woman hadn't been proper, and her divorce from her former husband. So you start to see, and again, as I say, there's no particular reason to doubt this testimony. You start to see things like that showing up. So you have the theology on the one side, right, which is sometimes turning extreme and very antithetical to traditional Jewish ideas of any kind. And then you also have the activities, the practices, where you sort of shift from these minor acts of ritual antinomianism, or even of people, there remain many people who are strictly observant in every way. You start to see people who go to an extreme of non-observance or of antinomian acts. So that is why somebody like Hajiz or somebody like Rabbi Yaakov Emden is very, very nervous about these people, because they seem to pose an enormous threat. And if you can imagine it like this, you think of the Jewish community as a big ball of dough. I don't know. All it takes is a little yeast. All it takes is one or two people teaching heretical ideas, and it spreads through the community, and the antinomianism spreads through the community. Essentially, that's what ended up happening in the 18th century with the Haskalah, right? Especially in Western and Central Europe. So they had a real reason to worry.
So essentially, when they're doing, especially the main two, like you said, Moshe Chagiz and Rabbi Yaakov Emden, when they're doing this McCarthyism, for lack of a better word, they're going after everybody. I mean, is that always what they're accusing? One of these two things that you mentioned there? Because when they're going after people that are seem like Shemer Torah mitzvahs, they seem like big Gedolim, Talmidei Chachamim, wrote Sfarim, they seem like Balei Halacha, everything seems okay, but are they trying to say, hey, in private, they're really doing these acts, or they really believe in this corrupt theology? Or is there something different? Like you said, you have these radical elements. That's not, at least in public, what everyone that they accused of seem like, especially Yaakov Emden in his writings seems to go after a lot of people and mention a lot of different things.
So I think that for these two figures, right, Sasportas is in a different category, because he's only busy with the Sabbateans at the height of the movement. After that, he sort of loses interest. But Rabbi Moshe Hajiz and Rabbi Yaakov Emden, for them, I think it's like a low plug. In other words, they don't really, I think, make distinctions between different types of Sabbateans. A Sabbatean is dangerous, and in a way, they might be right, because you see people like Chaim Malach, who accompanies Rabbi Yehuda Chosid to Jerusalem, right, on that great group expedition to Jerusalem in 1700. He starts out as a relative moderate. He's involved with the Italian group of Rabbi Avram Rovigo and the Rabach. And then he goes further afield. He goes to the Ottoman Empire. He meets certain people. He meets Shmuel Primo and some of the more extreme elements. And he turns from being a moderate and even pietistic Sabbatean to being a radical with some very wild ideas. So I think that they worry that anybody who's involved in this movement in any way at this point is a potential dangerous element. So they go after all kinds of people. And in many ways, it's a very dangerous pursuit for them, because the rabbinic world doesn't want to keep bringing this up. They may be willing to let people believe whatever it is they believe in secret and private. And because the more you bring it up, the more you make it public, the more the non-Jewish world sees the strange things that are going on in the Jewish community that are very suspicious and odd. The rabbis are embarrassed about all this because, aside from anything else, a shocking number of them were involved at the height of the movement or even afterwards, and they don't want that exposed. There are leading rabbis in all kinds of communities who continue to be Sabbateans, whether more secret or less secret. Look what happened to Rabbi Yaakov Emden. He went up against Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, and he essentially lost. In other words, Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz had more power, he had more adherents, he was in a strong rabbinic position, right? Of course, there's the whole thing about the position of the rabbinate of Prague and so on. Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz basically outgunned Rabbi Yaakov Emden. It wasn't, I mean, I don't want to get into the question of who's right and wrong or whatever, but just in sheer terms of, I hate to use the term, but almost power politics, Rabbi Yaakov Emden was steamrolled, right? And that happened to Hajiz a lot also in the Ramchal controversy. He had a lot of adherents outside Italy who didn't know anything, who didn't know the Luzzatto family, they didn't know anything about the Ramchal and so on. And right, the people inside Italy just basically stonewalled him, most of them, with one or two exceptions, right? They held him out. His supporters were people in Vilna and so on. But he, the only people who would, who would take on the task of this kind of heresy hunting are people who weren't at the center of the rabbinic world, if I could put it that way. Rabbi Moshe Hajiz was, despite who his father was quite marginal. And Rabbi Yaakov Emden, he got thrown out of various communities, one after another. He was willing to put his money where his mouth was, and it did not go well for him in terms of his professional standing. So this whole thing, the heresy hunting, there's the question of what exactly a Sabbatean is, and whether they all get thrown in the same basket. And then there's the question of how much do you want to risk by going after these people? And then is the underlying question, as you suggested, of let's say that nothing happens to somebody. Let's say you have a Rabbi Shlomo Ayalon who goes through an entire very successful career, dies in his old age, is, as far as we can tell, and I think the evidence is pretty strong, a Sabbatean all the way through. Who really cares? For me, I had an interesting experience. I have met two descendants of Rabbi Shlomo Ayalon, one way or the other, actually three. The fact that there are still descendants of his family who are Jewish in the 21st century suggests to me that mach nicht aus, I don't know, like it's if he believed whatever he believed, it doesn't seem to have sent his descendants into some kind of heretical purgatory. I don't know.
I mean, I think that's the question that everyone's so curious about, right? Is that he like you're saying, he seemed Sabbatean straight through, but yet he, on the other hand, he seemed to be standard. He wasn't like doing these mitzvah b'avera, at least in public. He was shomer Torah mitzvahs, right? He was the rabbi of Amsterdam. He was giving, as far as we know, he was giving halacha. He was the rabbi there in Amsterdam at that time. This is from the most powerful, biggest communities in the Jewish world, right? And he's like you're saying, and he has Jewish descendants. I mean, we're not going to answer one with the other. It's just, I don't know. It's just interesting to think about, right?
Yeah.
So obviously, there's a lot more to discuss on that question, and we're not going to get there. So let's move on to something else that you mentioned a few minutes ago that I want to pick up on. Is you mentioned, though, you weren't exactly discussing this, but you mentioned the Haskalah. So and then emancipation and everything that came with that. So what was kind of did Sabbateanism have an effect on Haskalah and what happened, and then emancipation and everything that happened in the Jewish community? And if so, what was that?
So there's a famous thesis by Gershom Scholem in his first major article about Sabbateanism called Mitzvah Haba Ba'avera, that was published in the early 1930s, 33 or 34, and I think. And he makes this argument at the end of the article that Sabbateanism, and especially Frankism, which he really conflated with Sabbateanism much more than people do now, that these movements, or the Sabbatean movement, fed more or less directly into the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, the Aufklärung, and into reform. And the basis of that argument was that the Sabbateans had become antinomians. They rejected halacha. They flung off the what you would call the Ol Malchut Shamayim, the responsibility to observe the commandments, and that was something that was attractive to certain Jews who became the maskilim. And he points out one or two individuals, especially a guy named Moshe Dabrushka, that he says, here, you can see this in action with this guy. He was just totally rejected by the world of Jewish studies for this thesis. For a long time, Yaakov Katz went at him. Shmuel Versis, who was the great scholar of Haskalah literature, wrote an entire book to refute this position about the relationship between Sabbateanism and Haskalah, which was, of course, right, very antithetical. And various other people, right? They all attacked Sholem. There's one guy who did not attack Sholem in an article he wrote, which I have found very useful for understanding the situation. Hillel Levine of Boston College wrote a book about Frankism as a cargo cult. So the cargo cult is a famous idea from anthropology based on anthropological studies of South Seas islands in the Pacific, South Pacific islands, where I won't go into it, but the essential idea is you have A causing B. The cause goes away, and a different cause shows up, but B continues to be the goal, right? So in this case, the idea that he's trying to bring across is that the antinomianism of the Sabbateans was based on their perception of certain approaches within Kabbalah, and they become antinomians. Their descendants and the friends of their descendants, the maskilim, continue to be interested in antinomianism and the rejection of halacha, but it's no longer because of these Sabbatean and Kabbalistic reasons. It's because of what we're familiar with, right? This sort of cultural and I don't know, whatever you would call it, historical rejection of Torah and the responsibility of the mitzvot. So his idea is almost like a cultural anthropological approach that you can't draw a straight line. It's not a straight line, but in the atmosphere of the 18th century, where many people were turning against the traditional understanding of Torah and the responsibility of the mitzvot already, that Sabbateanism could be sort of fit into that nexus or that context. And maybe he's right. I mean, something along those lines. In other words, I personally don't think that Sholem is entirely wrong. I think he's mostly wrong, but you can sort of see where the 18th century in especially in Western and Central Europe is a very weird kind of atmosphere. I mean, think about people like the Freemasons, right? The founders of Freemasonry were leading scientists, Newtonians, right? I always come back to Newton, right? Newtonians and members of the Royal Society and so on were among the founders of Freemasonry, and yet Freemasonry is all mystical and magical and has all these symbols and all this kind of stuff. How do those things fit together? Well, in the early 18th century, they did fit together for people. From our world, there's a figure, and my friend Marsha Keith Shukard has done this incredible work on this. There's a figure named the Baal Shem of London, Rabbi Shmuel Falk, the Baal Shem of London. There recently a book by Michal Oron, material about him was published. So Falk was named by Rabbi Yaakov Emden as a Sabbatean. He is considered one of the invisible superiors by the Freemasons. He's referred to as Dr. Falk by learned Europeans all over the place. He's associated with Emanuel Swedenborg. This is a very strange world in which kind of rationalist critique of religious principles and mysticism can somehow fit together and work together in ways that seem entirely incongruous to us. So that's where the idea comes from, of the influence of Sabbateanism on Haskalah and reform. It's all from a Sholem idea.
Also, I should give you a plug a little bit over here. You mentioned Newton, and for those that don't know, your first book is on Sir Isaac Newton, called Judaism and the Theology of Sir Isaac Newton. If anybody wants to go broke and spend like $150 on a book, it's a very expensive book. I think it's still available, right? It's just expensive.
I think I only own one copy myself. I can't afford it. Yes. I'm on an educator's salary.
So there is a book on Newton, if those want to know why you reference Newton over there. So, okay, so that's an interesting tidbit. And another thing that I've been asked a lot, I don't think we'll get into a lot, but just to briefly touch on, is the other, at that time also, 18th century, is the Sabbateanism's effect on Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov, and is there any real impact or connection?
So the work of Emmanuel Etkes is very helpful in understanding this situation. I will say that it's largely similar to the relationship between Sabbateanism and Haskalah, which is there is a relationship and it's almost entirely negative. The Hasidim, and Etkes explains this situation. He points out the timing of certain moments in the little we know of the history of the Baal Shem Tov in relationship to the Frankists, and he points out that the Baal Shem Tov was horrified by the Frankists and really rejected everything about anything that he knew to be Sabbateanism. Then on the other hand is the famous point that Sholem brought up and wrote about in a few places, that one of the late 17th century Sabbateans from Eastern Europe was Heschel Tzoref, who wrote a book called the Sefer HaTzoref, of which we have some fragments. Some pieces of that book, through various odd ways, made their way into the hands of the Baal Shem Tov, and he loved it. He thought that this was a holy and important book. It's mostly gematrios. It's all about Shema, all about the pasuk of Shema, but it involves a lot of who's Mashiach ben David, who's Mashiach ben Yosef, and so on. The Baal Shem Tov got his hands on this piece of this work, and he considered it great Torah. And famously, somehow that work and Heschel Tzoref, the author, became conflated with this mythical figure called Adam Baal Shem, that was kind of a revered figure in the circle of the Baal Shem Tov. So this material found its way, right? The Sabbatean material found its way into the hands of the Baal Shem Tov. But like much of the Sabbatean material of the 18th century, it was unrecognizable to most people as Sabbateanism. In other words, anybody could read it and have not an inkling that there was anything Sabbatean about it unless they knew what to look for. And of course, they had the will to try and find it. That's what happened with Sefer Chemdas Hayamim, for example, and lots of other 18th century works. Some of them it's more obvious, some of it's more subtle, but clearly a lot of this material could be read without somebody even realizing that it was Sabbatean, or even if they did, sort of willing to ignore that because it was interesting and important Kabbalistic writing.
A good place to look if listeners are interested is Batal Naor, who I had on. He in his Sabbateanism, his book, he does discuss some Torah connections there with Hasidus, and also a lot of these sometimes tenuous connections, and going through these various things that you wouldn't necessarily know to be Sabbatean. So people can check that out. So one other thing about the Baal Shem Tov, I know you had mentioned to me there's something about former messiahs and the Baal Shem Tov B'Shiv Chabesht. Maybe you also wanted to mention.
Yeah. So in some elided passages from the Shivchei Abesht, it appears that the Besht at some point tried to rescue the soul of Sabbatai Tzvi. Sabbatai Tzvi, on his part, apparently at some point tried to rescue the soul of Jesus of Nazareth. So what it seems to be, to me, is that the Mashiach, the Messiah, to be a successful Messiah, has to rescue everybody. He has to save everybody. That's his job as the Mashiach. Everybody's an Avaryan, everybody's a sinner, and he has to rescue the worst of the worst. And for the Jews in the time of Sabbatai Tzvi, that was Jesus of Nazareth, who's talked about in both clandestine and recognized literature in some terrible ways. Well, if you're the Messiah, you'd better be able to rescue him, because otherwise, what kind of Messiah are you? I mean, it's easy to rescue tzaddikim, but rescuing Jesus of Nazareth from this pallet that he's on down in Ganem, wow, that's, and of course, Sabbatai Tzvi shortly afterwards becomes somebody who's regarded in the Jewish world in kind of the same way. This horrible person whose evil is just beyond anything that anybody can imagine. Well, the Baal Shem Tov is going to try and rescue him. So, as I told you earlier, the way that I regard it is like a toy that they used to have when I was a kid called a barrel of monkeys, where the monkeys had these arms that were sort of twisted into curves. And the trick was you take one and you try to catch the arm of the next one, and with that one, try to catch the arm of the next one until you pull them all out. Well, that's what the Mashiach has to do. So each successive Mashiach is trying to rescue not only all the other Jews, but also all the, as it were, failed messiahs of the past. That's the lineage that you have to pull out and save, because who knows who was and who wasn't, from the, especially in the Kabbalistic worldview, who knows who was and who wasn't part of the soul family of the Messiah, and had maybe should have been a successful Messiah, but wasn't because of some interference from who knows what. Got to save them all.
Okay, so another thing here, and for the listeners, we're hopping around a couple different things, because like I said, I want to just tie up some loose ends, some questions that I got, and things that we kind of didn't get to, that I think, as far as I remember, we didn't get to in the previous episodes. Another one is, are there any minhagim and practices that either done today that have Sabbatean origins, or maybe things that, I don't know, that any done like that started off their origins, I guess, to reject Sabbatai Tzvi?
So I don't know of any minhagim that we have that are directly intended to reject Sabbatai Tzvi. I got to think about that more, but nothing came to mind when you asked me about that. Betzalel Naor has two examples of minhagim that were associated by people in the 19th or 20th century with Sabbateanism, and the reasons are rather vague. The one that interested me is the backwards tzaddik in Safrus, in scribal writing, in Torah scrolls, and in mezuzot and tefillin. And the reason I was particularly interested in that is because my tefillin, for various unusual reasons, are what's called ksav, which I believe has that backwards tzaddik. So I'm now concerned about this, but it was a little hard to follow the reasons that people thought this and the Ribono Shalom that's said in front of the Aron Kodesh on holidays were the two examples given by Naor, like quite what the Sabbatean origins of those ideas were. I had some trouble with that, but I myself saw something more specific when I was in the Esnoga, in the Great Synagogue in Amsterdam, one time. So outside of Eretz Yisrael, Jews normally do not say the Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing, on a daily or a weekly basis. It's only said on holidays. At that synagogue, they still say it. I mean, I was only there on a Shabbat, and they still did it. They did it on a regular Shabbat. And that was a minhag that was associated with Sabbateanism. And Yaakov Sasportas, who had been a Rav in Amsterdam, and at the time of the height of the movement was in Hamburg, and later was again in Amsterdam, eventually as the chief rabbi, he decried this practice. He said, you really, really have to stop that. The idea of doing that more often than on the holidays, the times that all the communities do it, came from the Sabbateans, and it has to stop. But apparently it didn't stop. My experience was that they still did it.
Wow, okay, that's interesting to know. So, or that's an interesting point. So, I think two main final questions up here. First of all, one I think is a bit of a heavy one, is, how has the view or the conception of Mashiach today been impacted by the movement and by Sabbatai Tzvi? I guess today, and also what I would say throughout the century since, but I guess let's just say it as today, or you can touch on anything before as well.
So any time that something unusual happens in the Jewish world, theologically or practically, unless it's in the direction of, well, even then, any mystical movement, any interesting innovation, anything like that, there will immediately be people who will be crying out that this is either Sabbateanism, which is popping up again, or that this is the same as Sabbateanism. Look how similar it is. And because the Sabbatean movement had so many different aspects and pieces and different people, members or participants writing and different ideas, it's not hard to sort of say, oh, this Hasidism or this mystical group or this person who is making claims that seem to be leaning toward messianism. And of course, we know about this syndrome, right? What they call the Jerusalem syndrome of people popping up and claiming to be Mashiach. I lived among the places that I lived. I grew up in Los Angeles, and then I lived for 10 years in Jerusalem. I think those are the two world headquarters of messiahs. They just show up with incredible regularity at these two locations. I assume that there's an exchange program also, so that they go back and forth. And any time that somebody is taken as more than just a complete crank, and starts to develop a following, the first thing that people will say is it's the Sabbateans, it's the Sabbateim again. So it has sensitized the Jewish world to the problematic aspects of messianism in a way that hadn't really existed before. In other words, before Sabbatai Tzvi, there were many Jewish messiahs. We know the Rambam warned people about them, various people warned people about them, but it was always considered, maybe this is the one, maybe this is it. And it was a disappointment afterwards and so on, but it wasn't considered sort of existentially dangerous to the Jewish people. After the Sabbatean movement, the dangers of both radical Kabbalah and Messianism became manifest, and they came to the forefront of Jewish consciousness in a way that they're always there now.
Okay, so I think the real final question that I guess I'll leave you with for this episode is something that I think after doing this whole series, and this is our third episode together, and I think listeners have asked me, and people are probably wondering is, why should I care? Is this just historical? Like any other history book, it's just another historical thing, but why should we care about Shabtaut, Sabbateanism, or Mashiach, or Mishichud? Why do we care? Why does anybody care about any of this? Is there an effect from any of this? Why should we care?
I imagine that for people who don't study history and aren't interested in history, every day must be an amazing new adventure. Wow, here's something that's never happened before. Wait, a corrupt politician, you're telling me? Oh my goodness. Oh, this guy claims to be the Messiah. Holy cow, he must be. You have to learn what's happened in the past to understand what's happening in the present. Everything about our world is shaped by what's happened in the past. So Sabbateanism is a very important example, because we saw really in many ways what Sabbateanism did. I think it was not the watershed that introduced Judaism into the modern world. It was not the shift from the medieval or early modern to the modern period in Jewish history. What it did is, how can I explain this? Did you ever paint? Did you ever paint a room? Did you ever with paint, right? So before you put on the final layer of paint, what you're supposed to do is what's called a skim coat, right? It's a coat that you put over, and it shows up where there are problems, where there are things in the wall or the previous paint that you need to fix before you put on the final layer. the Sabbatean movement was kind of a skim coat for the Jewish community. It exposed the weakness of the institution of the rabbinate. It exposed some of the issues that are latent within Kabbalah that had never come out before, but were there in potential. It exposed issues about the anthropological, the sociological, the psychological issues within the Jewish community, and in some ways, even more broadly than that. You saw the potential for these crazy, seemingly, I would have thought, impossible fragmentary movements and ideas popping up in the Jewish world when the infrastructure of Jewish ideas and Jewish belief and so on had been allowed to kind of ossify and weaken. So especially the weakness of the rabbinate really came out with this movement. And it's really worth it for Jews today to sort of see, well, here is what you're wondering what can happen if things go sideways in this or that in the Jewish world. Well, here's what can happen.
So basically, that's really, I want to thank you for joining me, again, to talk about this for a third episode. Thank you for sticking with me for 3 episodes. I'm sure the listeners are appreciative as well. And if anyone has any questions, I'm sure they can email you or just reach out to me and I can ask you. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to add one more thing, which is several people asked me about the Chida and his seemingly he writes about people who were Sabbateans and Sabbatean authors, and in some cases important figures in the movement, without having anything to say about their Sabbatean ideas or any negative comments about that. My teacher, Rabbi Schnorr from Los Angeles, wrote me about this, and 1 or 2 other people. So I want to say that if you're interested in that subject, Meir Benayahu, in his book about Chida, deals with this. I believe it's on pages 127 to maybe 135. He kind of addresses this. I am in no position to address it myself, but I suggest looking over there.
Okay, so that's great. And like I said, if people want, I'm sure it seems like people can email you if they want to with any questions on this.
Right. I've told you everything I know, or I purport to know, so I may not be able to answer any further questions, but I can try.
Or maybe you can refer them to, like you just said, books or things that they can check out. I mean, that's also what I wanted to ask you. Just finally, I mean, is there? I'll link, just because you came on, a bunch of times. I'll link again to your book on this, even though that's not exactly about what we discussed here on this episode on the Sabbatean prophets. But and obviously Sholem, we've mentioned with, for lack of a better word, ad nauseum on this series.
Right.
His big tome. Are there? I mentioned a lot of the other books. Are there any other books, probably in Hebrew, like specifically talk about a lot of these questions? I mean, are there?
Yeah. So Sholem, first of all, wrote a ton of things about this. There are the 2 volumes of his articles that are extremely valuable for all of these topics. There is all the work by Meir Benayahu, which is focused in Sfunot Gimel Daled, right? That entire, right? That's not all Benayahu, but that Sfunot Gimel Daled is all about Sabbateanism, and Sfunot Yud Daled is all Meir Benayahu, and a lot of it is about this period. There is the book by Ada Rappaport Albert about women in the Sabbatean movement, extremely important. The Mixed Multitude, which is Pavel Macheko's extremely important book about the Frankist movement. Cengiz Shishman's book about the Donmeh, and also Mark Baer's work on the Donmeh. I don't know, the rest, I'm sure I'm missing some, but and Yaakov Barnai's work. there's a lot more that's scattered all over the place. There's also this 2-volume. 1 second. Yes, Hachalom Ushvaro, right? Hatnua Shabtai V'Shluchoteha. So that's a 2-volume work that was published at Magnus Press. But there's just much more. There's a lot more in the volumes of Daniel Abrams' journal Kabbalah. Lots and lots of important material there. Sometimes in I don't know, all over the place.
Yeah, I'm sure there's dissertations and articles and things scattered everywhere that people can check out.
I have to especially mention Noam Leffler is writing incredible work on the movement, and very careful, very valuable work. Hadar Feldman on the Donmeh, super interesting work. So there are lots of young scholars doing amazing stuff.
And I want to throw in, I mentioned that I had, the previous episode of Tzal Naor and post-Sabbatean Sabbateanism, if people are more textual analysis, and as well as he has a book under a pseudonym called Caught in the Crack on interviews he conducted with Donmeh or people that are descended of Donmeh. It's an interesting book. I think he wrote it under like Ruvain Alport. I'm forgetting the name, but it's called Caught in the Crack. I can put the link. People can check it out or look at the Naor episodes. That's another one. So like you said, there's a lot of stuff all over the place. And hopefully this series was comprehensive, but not something that covered everything. I think that's impossible, certainly. So it just was a springboard. If anyone's interested in more, they're able to go from there to get more. This series, like I said, it didn't cover everything. It doesn't claim to. It didn't. And also, I said, even though I'm calling this a finale, there will be more episodes about this that I hope to get to in the future. And thank you, Professor Goldish, for joining me for a third time on the series to discuss this. I really appreciate it.
I'm honored. Thank you so much.